about kosher divorce. And they have also recently published an article about their work in studying divorce and the populations that they study. And so I would like to hand it over to them at this point.
And we are recording this paper again.
Thank you. I'm going to share a screen now. Okay, did I get that right, Betina?
You did, Dee. It looks great.
Wonderful. So thank you to Lilach for chairing our session, and thank you, Justin, and all of the CSJS team who've worked so hard to make this conference happen. It's our pleasure to be here today and to share our research with you. As Betina and I are in Ottawa, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. What happens when non-Orthodox Jews negotiate Canadian Jewish divorce? Canadian Jews are overwhelmingly not Orthodox. And yet when non-Orthodox Jews divorce religiously, they have the choice of Orthodox or non-Orthodox practice. Jewish divorce across denominations is shaped by persistently Orthodox norms. And based on interviews conducted over the last 6 years, this paper explores how this disjunction in Canadian Jewish life, mapped across denominational communities and identities, impacts divorce. We argue that this disjunction is key to understanding the distinct Canadian experience of divorce.
All Jewish divorce across denominations already proceeds in relation to, in conversation with, and in response to Orthodox praxis. In over 100 interviews, our research shows that there are real concerns among both rabbis and laypersons as to the legitimacy of divorce and the possible consequences of the failure of possible consequences to future generations if divorce is not enacted correctly. That Orthodox practice is normative may seem self-evident, but an emphasis on correct practice or orthopraxy is at odds with the reality that the majority of Canadian Jews do not self-identify as Orthodox. In speaking to non-Orthodox Jews, we hear how these concerns drive non-Orthodox Jews towards Orthodox practice, but also how commitments to egalitarianism, inclusion, and one's own denominational practice also drives non-Orthodox practice.
For all denominations, it's possible, divorce is possible because in the Hebrew Bible, there are instructions on how to divorce. The man is the active party giving the divorce to his passively receiving wife, and the divorce permits the woman to enter into another marriage. In the Hebrew Bible, the definition of adultery is sexual relations between a man, married or unmarried, and a woman who's married to another man. This reflects the reality that men could marry more than one wife and that sexual relations with an unmarried woman could be a form of betrothal. In contrast, a woman can only be married to one man, and if a married woman has a child by someone other than her husband, the issue is religiously illegitimate and known as a mamzer. A mamzer can only marry another mamzer, cannot hold certain leadership roles and ritual offices in the community, and the status is inherited.
This original understanding of divorce from the Bible is inherited by Rabbinic Judaism and is outlined in the Mishnah and the Talmud. To give you one example from the Mishnah, we'll quote from Mishnah Yevamot 14:1. A man who gives a divorce is not like a woman who is divorced, for while a woman can be divorced with her consent as well as without it, a man divorces only with his full consent.
According to halacha, divorce is an asymmetrical gendered process. Only men have the power to grant divorces, and women cannot secure their own religious divorces. The legal fact of a husband's unilateral power to initiate a divorce opens a woman up to the possibility of get abuse, which may include the man withholding the get in exchange for monetary or other concessions, or delaying or even denying the get outright. If a get is denied, a woman becomes an aguna, a chained woman, chained to an otherwise dead marriage, and she and her potential children bear the bitter consequences of that failure.
Unlike in Israel or Europe, North American Jewish practice is shaped by denominational affiliation, and each denomination has policies around divorce practice. In comparison with the US, Canada skews a little bit more traditional in terms of the prevalence of conservative affiliation, but also in terms of a preference for traditional practice in which Orthodox practice is normative. Despite the normativity of Orthodox practice, 44% of Canadian Jews self-identify with a non-Orthodox denomination. But framed another way or flipped, 80% of Canadian Jews do not affiliate with an Orthodox denomination. But those that do pursue religious divorce often find themselves negotiating Orthodox divorce practices that are significantly at odds with their own Jewish practice and identity.
As we speak about Canadian divorce, we cannot overestimate the role of geography and demographics. And so we offer these statistics as a reminder to how Canadian Jewry is both concentrated in a very few cities and dispersed in smaller communities across Canada.
The material site of Jewish divorce is the Beit Din, or religious court, that addresses all issues of Jewish status. For Orthodox Jews, correct religious practice depends on traditional interpretations and applications of halacha. For this reason, there are standing Orthodox Batei Din in Canada's largest urban Jewish communities of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. This standing infrastructure and easy access to proxy divorces, together with the pull of orthopraxy, means that these Batei Din become the site of non-Orthodox Jewish divorces from across Canada.
For non-Orthodox Jews, there is a set of early questions that must be settled, including what type of divorce they hope to pursue, but also what type of divorce they realistically have access to. Respondents describe their paths to Orthodox practice as being driven by concerns for the legitimacy of the divorce, limited choices of denominational practice, and often a lack of knowledge of the process or the options that might be available. The halakhic status of the original marriage, especially in terms of the Jewish status of a converted spouse, may make Orthodox divorce impossible. Non-Orthodox practice is also driven by the mistaken belief that non-Orthodox divorce would be considered legitimate across the larger community, and by individual commitments to egalitarianism or one's own denominational community.
Unsurprisingly, the power of men to refuse to grant a divorce is key to many choices. A recalcitrant husband may preclude the possibility of an Orthodox divorce. We also heard of the odd circumstance where a couple was divorced twice, once orthodoxly and once conservatively. In this case, the Orthodox divorce was initiated by the wife after her husband had already approached the conservative rabbi where they lived. She was friends with an Orthodox rabbi who expressed concern that their conservative divorce would just not be, quote, kosher enough. And as she explained to her husband at the time, the Orthodox rabbi, and I quote, really thinks that it would be better long-term to get an Orthodox get, just to be on the safe side, end quote. The husband at first refused. And then as she continues, quote, and then he said, well, I'll give you an Orthodox divorce, but only if you agree to go along with the first one we started. And I said, why? Why would we do both? But to assuage her husband's ego, she went along with this plan and received 2 divorces. We hear how Orthodox practice is normative beyond the Orthodox community, and how in turn Orthodox understandings of orthopraxy drives divorce practice. This woman had deep ties to conservative Judaism, but was persuaded by the arguments of the need for a correct Orthodox divorce. In that Orthodox divorce praxis is wholly accepted by all denominations, the husband's insistence on conservative practice is striking. While some might advocate for particular practice because of denominational commitments, at least in the view of the wife in this case, the insistence was an expression of male power.
For non-Orthodox women especially, the fact of structural gender differences of even beginning the divorce process can be deeply disturbing. While a woman may contact the Beit Din, if her husband is unwilling, she can't simply compel him to attend. Quote, they're very, I want to say the word chauvinistic. They wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't do anything for me until they spoke to my ex-husband, because without his consent, it wasn't going any further.
We hear in our interviews how the default to Orthodox practice is often uncomfortable for non-Orthodox and especially secular Jews. While these same respondents also view this practice as normative and expected in terms of the perceived legitimacy of traditional practices. Non-Orthodox respondents, male and female, framed their experience of Jewish divorce at Orthodox Batei Din in terms of that alienation and alterity. This sense of otherness was consistently tied to engaging in this Orthodox space as a non-Orthodox Jew, and was interpreted as exclusionary and linked to their lack of religious observance. And so I quote, "So the Orthodox are different. The Orthodox are a whole different ballgame. I don't feel like I'm Jewish in their presence. Like, you're Jewish because you're Jewish, but you're not really Jewish." End quote. Women unsurprisingly speak of another sense of otherness, where the space is perceived as a male space, and male consent and agency is privileged, and where male expertise and authority is enacted. In Canadian Orthodox Bate Din, this is a space where women are literally outnumbered. They may often only be the only female in a room facing 7 or more men.
When asked about their experience at the Beit Din, non-Orthodox respondents frequently pointed to how the rabbis and witnesses had a habit of speaking amongst themselves in Hebrew or Yiddish. They believed that the rabbis did so because the rabbis assumed they couldn't understand what was being spoken. And after this experience, one conservative male respondent reflects that the more instruction and clarity is needed at the Beit Din. Otherwise, the couple is in the dark throughout the whole process and is watching the rabbinical authorities discussing issues amongst themselves in another language. Their belief that the choice of the rabbis and witnesses to speak language they did not speak was correlated with larger feelings of otherness. This was true even when a lay person understood what was being said. In this next case, the woman was a Reformed Jew who divorced at the Montreal Beit Din. In her own understanding, she was perceived in particular ways because she was a non-Orthodox woman and had had a Reformed marriage that now required a divorce.
And I quote, "So the men are speaking Yiddish to each other, and they have no idea that I'm understanding everything that they're saying. And one of them told a very inappropriate joke. And I laughed out loud. And their faces when they realized that I understood Yiddish, they were horrified, 4 red faces, and not one of them said another word the whole time." This respondent then goes on to describe herself using a Yiddish sexist and ethnocentric slur for a non-Jewish woman, when she is unquestionably Jewish. This speaks to the ways in which the non-Orthodox Jews believe they are viewed, but also how women bear a particular burden to be good Jewish women, and the divorcing non-Orthodox woman may feel she has failed on both these fronts.
One conservative woman gestured to this gender double otherness, explains that as a non-Orthodox woman, she expected maltreatment. Quote, "I had heard very scary stories, to be honest. I heard that they yell at you, that they make you feel bad, that you feel ashamed." Despite her concerns, she reflects, quote, "I didn't have that experience at all. I actually thought they were very nice, and they actually have a sense of humor." Her surprise that she was not maltreated links to how all of the rabbis that we spoke to at Bate Din had heard these concerns and had told us how they're conscious of these anxieties, and they have enacted changes in their processes and tone to make women and non-Orthodox Jews more comfortable.
If Orthodox Bate Din make many non-Orthodox Jews feel like they're strangers in a strange land, what happens when they pursue non-Orthodox divorce? Of course, there are times where this just isn't possible. While Orthodox Bate Din encourage Orthodox practice as both universal and correct, their strict halachic definition of Jewish status excludes many individuals who identify as Jewish and may want to seek a Jewish divorce. We heard one story where the husband had converted to Judaism within the Reform movement, and the wife explained that she immediately contacted the local conservative rabbi upon seeking a divorce. There is a standing Orthodox Beit Din in her city, but that Beit Din wouldn't recognize her husband's conversion and therefore saw no need for a Jewish divorce. This was pragmatic and procedural for the Beit Din, but was in painful opposition to the respondent's own understanding of the legitimacy of her marriage and her deeply held Jewish belief that a Jewish marriage needed a Jewish divorce. The conservative rabbi shared her understanding, recognized the conversion, and was adamant that she halachically required a Jewish divorce. Her conviction that, of course, she needed a get led to her dismay when she learned that there was no standing conservative Beit Din. And I quote, "And I remember just crying, like, what am I supposed to do? This isn't right. How do you allow people to be married, but then make it impossible?" The rabbi then explained that he would arrange the divorce, but would have to do so using a proxy through a Beit Din in Los Angeles. As scholars, we hear in this story how for this woman and for her rabbi, the original marriage was legitimately Jewish and needed, on the basis of halacha, a Jewish divorce. That the Orthodox Beit Din saw this as unnecessary highlights an underlying tension in Jewish divorce around questions of correct practice, authority, and Jewish identity.
Before we conclude, we'd like to share a little bit about the non-Orthodox denominational processes that non-Orthodox Jews might pursue. Although the conservative movement affirms egalitarianism as a Jewish value, conservative divorce processes are not egalitarian in that they retain the gender roles for heterosexual marriages. They prevent agunot through halakhic solutions that end or annul the marriage, which also renders the category of mamzer inoperable. In cases of same-sex marriage, conservative practice establishes a fully egalitarian marriage ceremony, which enables a fully egalitarian divorce ritual and precludes the possibility of an aguna or an agun. Conservative practice in Canada truly depends on the city in which you live. For example, in Toronto until 2014, there was a local standing conservative Beit Din under the leadership of Rabbi Stephen Salzman. Upon his death, there was a conversation held between the conservative rabbis of Toronto and the Orthodox Beit Din, where there was an agreement by the conservative rabbis where they consented to sending their congregants to the standing Orthodox Beit Din wherever possible. This suggests that Toronto conservative Jews don't have access to conservative divorce unless the Orthodox Beit Din won't perform the divorce.
Reform and Reconstructionist divorce practices are distinct in their emphasis on egalitarian processes. Both movements reject the validity of the categories of aguna and mamzer as unethical and in violation of Jewish values. Early in its development, the US-based Reform movement asserted that Reform Jews did not require a get to end a marriage and to remarry Jewishly. In practice, Canadian rabbis historically and in characteristically more traditional Canadian fashion required Jewish divorces for remarriage. We hear how in the past Canadian Reform rabbis directed their congregants to Orthodox Batei Din in person or by proxy, or they struck their own ad hoc Beit Din. With the establishment of the only standing Reform Beit Din in Canada, Toronto hosts what is now known as the Reform Beit Din of Canada, and Reform divorce practice is accessible by proxy to all Canadian Reform Jews. Younger rabbis tell us that they will not send their congregants to the Orthodox Beit Din. With the ease of accessibility of the Toronto Reform Beit Din, they are increasingly recommending it as a preferred option as it aligns with their values of egalitarianism and LGBTQS+ inclusiveness.
While Reconstructionist Judaism similarly struggled with the gendered inequality of divorce from its inception, its founder, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, insisted on Jewish divorce practice as it was essential to Jewish communal and individual identity. Kaplan advocated for transforming halakhic processes to reflect the essential equality between the genders. Reconstructionist divorce practice in Canada continues this original egalitarian emphasis. And Rabbi Elizabeth Bolton of Ottawa describes how the movement uses one ceremony, which retains the giving and receiving of the get, but offers 4 separate processes that accounts for the gender of the person giving the divorce and whether the receiving spouse consents to the process. With only 3 Reconstructionist rabbis serving affiliated congregations across Canada, Reconstructionist rabbis have always struck their own ad hoc Batei Din, following the movement's guiding documents. And these are currently being updated to include non-binary options as well.
Each of the non-Orthodox denominations engage in practices that they view as addressing the problem of inegalitarian divorce processes and as a solution to the gendered injustice of agunot. Each views their processes as legitimate and in continuity with halacha and tradition. Yet from the Orthodox perspective, as a matter of correct practice, these solutions do no work to resolve the problem of the aguna and are viewed as a threat to Klal Yisrael. Non-Orthodox practices, including patrilineal descent, conversion, and divorce, provoke urgent anxieties about Jewish status and the unity and continuity of the Jewish people. Non-Orthodox rabbis and laypersons negotiate this communal terrain, exposing how the force of orthopraxy in the larger community around divorce is in increasing tension with how the majority of Canadian Jews practice Judaism on a day-to-day basis.
In conclusion, extending our original theoretical framework of troubling orthopraxy to the question of non-Orthodox divorce choices, this research contributes new data as to the variability of Jewish divorce across denominations in Canada. Our interviews reveal a diversity and variability of Jewish divorce practice that is grounded in historical, denominational, and regional contexts, but also in the life histories of the individual communities, rabbis, and divorcing couples. These each shape Jewish divorce in distinctly Canadian ways. And in sharing these stories, we suggest that scholars must examine how Jews actually experience divorce and how divorce practice is situated, contextual, and trans-denominational. Thank you.
Thank you.